Hey everyone, it's Jen from You So Much, and today is Fantasy Friday. And today's quote is, "Humans need fantasy to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape." And that quote is by Pratchett, who was a fantasy novelist, and in fact that quote is from one of his books, Hogfather. For those of you who don't know him, Terry Pratchett was a prolific fantasy novelist. He wrote 41 books in his series, his Discworld series alone, on top of a lot of other books that he wrote. He was born in 1948 in Beaconsfield, Buckinghamshire, and at the age of only 13, he had his first story published. He wrote for the local school paper, and then it was published later, and he used the money he got from that to buy himself a typewriter. So he immediately knew he wanted to be a writer, and he obviously invested in writing right away. He loved writing tools. In fact, later on, as he got older, when computers were in the mix, he was known to have monitors all over the house. I think it was like 6 or 7 monitors that he had, so he could easily start writing whenever he felt like it. So I love that about him. He later became a journalist. He actually quit school to become a journalist and got some success there, but then started working for the electric board. And while he was working there, he started writing his fantasy novels. The first one in his Discworld series was called The Color of Magic. And Discworld, by the way, was the fictional setting of his stories. He eventually wrote 41 books in the Discworld series, and he often parodied what was going on in the real world in the books. And he started getting a lot of popularity early on because one of his earlier books was called Equal Rights, and it covered a lot of feminist issues. And he was interviewed by the BBC's Woman's Hour, and that's when he really started getting noticed and getting more and more popular. He actually wrote a children's book in this series as well, and he got the Carnegie Medal Award for that, and that's the award he said he was most proud of. He was also knighted by the Queen for his literary efforts, even though he always said he was not writing literature. And I love that. In fact, one of the reasons why he said he was writing fantasy in the first place is that he could bend the universe around his stories at his whim. All in all, he ended up writing an average of about 2 books per year. So for those of you writers out there, that's a pretty big deal. I am so in awe of that. And he ended up later in life getting diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he even continued writing through his Alzheimer's. He passed away in 2015, but his last and final book was published a couple of months after his death, so he wrote all the way up until the very end. So what does this quote mean? Well, if you've read the book and the scene in the book where this quote is, the characters are talking about the human condition and how we as humans need to believe the little lies so that we can believe the big lies. And so why do we need to believe in lies, right? That's kind of the question that's posed. And the answer was, well, we need to believe in the big lies because otherwise they won't come true. And I think it's sort of referring to how we're able to rise above just being animals, right? We're not apes, and yet we aren't angels either, right? We are still flesh and blood. We're human. We make errors. We make tons of mistakes. And so we're somewhere there in between. And it kind of reminds me of one of my favorite all-time quotes that I just love so much. It's from the book Sapiens. And this quote says, "You could never convince a monkey to give you a banana by promising him limitless bananas after death in monkey heaven." And I love that quote because it really illustrates what sets the humans apart from the animals, right? We have been able to use our imagination to tell each other stories and convince each other of possibility. We see that something bigger and greater is possible. And so we talk to each other about that. We cooperate with each other. We create something out of nothing because we have imagination that the animals do not. Even if it is a complete falsehood, right? It's only a complete falsehood right now, but if we just believe in it and we work on it together, it's amazing what we can accomplish. Our ability to believe in these stories and basically create reality out of these fantasies that we have has been able to improve our lives in massive ways. Using our imagination and stories, we have been able to create such amazing pleasure with entertainment, right? Like books, plays, songs. And then on top of that, we've been able to create amazing technologies. Let's just look at the transportation industry. Before the car was made, people would have thought that guy was crazy creating a car, right? Airplanes, like in retrospect, those were fantasies that people thought that they were nuts to try and invent. And yet they had a fantasy for something and they created that reality out of that fantasy. I think about electricity and the light bulb. I think about communication like the telephone, and then eventually the cell phone and our iPhones, computers that we basically walk around with. I mean, the communications that we are able to have with someone across the world. Someone right now on YouTube could be watching this in a completely different country, at a completely different time zone, and all through the amazing technology that we have been able to create just from our imagination and being able to believe in those little lies that we're able to create this amazing future together. And storytelling allows us to bring our fantasies into reality, right? Because if I have a fantasy of something and I share it with somebody else, that somebody else is going to be much more likely to help me make it come true. We can work together to create a better future, to improve our lives together. And without our imagination, without that ability to see that possibility for the future, we're basically just monkeys hanging out in the jungle eating bananas. And that's why storytellers are so powerful. In fact, the most powerful people in the world are the ones that are able to tell these stories. I think about people like Trump, love him or hate him, Beyonce, Richard Branson, Terry Pratchett, right? They have been able to engage our imagination and tell the most compelling stories that move us as a human race forward. When I think about stories, I think about my grandfather, and he was known as the storyteller in the family, right? Everyone knew that he could tell amazing, compelling stories and jokes, and almost all the pictures I have of my grandfather, he's in a circle, he's got a pipe in his mouth, and he's got people surrounding him, listening to him telling a story. And then I think about people like my mom, who's a teacher, and I think in order to be an effective teacher, you also have to be a great storyteller, not just because you're reading stories during class time, but because you have to be able to engage with the children. And in order to do that, you have to be able to tell stories, because that is our most powerful way that we communicate with each other. And my dad is a salesperson. Every great salesperson pretty much needs to be a good storyteller. And the best salespeople compel their customers with a story of how they can help them better their lives. Whether they're true or false, stories have persuaded us to do pretty much everything we do on a daily basis, right? Whether we're going to see the doctor or we're going to church on Sunday, there's been an element of storytelling that has convinced us that we need to do that. And the truth is, everybody loves a good story. We all love stories. That's why we use them to communicate. They capture our attention and they pull at our heartstrings and they get us feeling all the feelings. And that's why it's the most powerful way that you can communicate, whether it's with a customer or whether it's with your kids or a partner or a friend. And speaking of powerful stories, if you would like to learn how to tell a story that your customer cares about, then I highly suggest you sign up for my Story Juice email course. It's a free course that walks you through how to figure out the journey that your customer is on, what's their story arc look like, and how can you help them reach their goals? How can you make their fantasies come true? I'll put the link up above and in the description down below. And if you have any thoughts about this quote or storytelling or fantasy, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to write down your own fantasies, because words make it real. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.